Good morning, everyone. My name is Adam, and I'm the park interpreter here in Whiteshell Provincial Park. The Whiteshell is located on Treaty 3 territory, which is the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, and Métis Nation. Now, before we get too far into it, I first want to thank everybody for joining me for this webinar this morning, where we're going to talk all about winter adaptations. And just to get ourselves in the right mind frame, the first thing I'd like everybody to do is actually close their eyes and just listen to this sound. Hopefully lots of us have heard that before. That is one of my favorite sounds. And to start off with, take this poll to see if you guys can figure out what type of bird that was. If it was a bald eagle, a black-capped chickadee, or a gray jay. Just going to lean in to take a look at our survey. So about 60% of you said black-capped chickadee and 40% said gray jay. That was the sound of the black-capped chickadee. So those of you that selected that one, congratulations, you got it exactly right. That is one of my favorite noises to hear. And a lot of times when we hear it, whether we have feeders in our yard or if we're walking on trails or out in nature, a lot of times we probably think of this cute little bird that comes to our feeders. While that is accurate, they are cute. The reality is they, along with really all animals that stay active during the winter, are some of the toughest animals on the planet. And they've actually helped us be able to survive the winter as well. Animals that have inadvertently helped us all throughout time with picking up some of the tricks of the trade of surviving. So by learning about these adaptations and understanding them, we can not only appreciate these animals, but have a better chance at surviving the winter. Now, like I said, all throughout time, all people have found different ways of surviving by looking at nature, including indigenous groups that inhabited the area. Today, we're going to go over some of the really cool examples of winter adaptations. But before we get too far into that, first off, we have to really examine what is an adaptation. In a nutshell, an adaptation is either a behavior an animal has or something that animal has on their body that helps it live in its habitat. For example, the webbed feet on animals like this mallard and other types of ducks and geese. Webbed feet are a great adaptation for them because it allows them to swim faster through the water and have easier access to food. Another really cool adaptation would be like on this guy right here, the porcupine. One of his cool adaptations, as it's stabbing me right now, are the quills that this porcupine has. Great adaptation and a great deterrent for animals that are looking at this guy like a holiday meal. Now, all of our ducks and geese have migrated south for the winter, and while the porcupine's quills are a cool adaptation, it doesn't really have all that much to do with winter. They have the quills year-round. So let's take a look at some winter adaptations, and we'll start with our winter birds. So the black-capped chickadee we heard at the beginning is one of them. But another cool example is this bird right here. This is the gray jay, also known in some circles as the Canada jay. A couple of years ago, there was a public vote, and the gray jay was voted by the public as our national bird. Gray jays, along with black-capped chickadees, blue jays, nuthatches, and grosbeaks, really all the perching birds we would see at bird feeders in the winter, they have really two cool adaptations that help them survive through the winter. See if you can pick up any of these that we may have started doing, especially around this time of year. Number one, eat as much as you possibly can. And number two, only move when you absolutely have to. Kind of sounds like us around the holiday season, right? Or any teenager for that matter. Now, when I say eat as much as physically possible, I don't mean, for example, when we have a little bit too much turkey or a little too much ham after Thanksgiving and our stomach sticks out a little bit. These guys put us to shame with how much they eat. These little birds can eat enough during the day to gain between 20 and 50% of their body weight in a day. For perspective, that would be like me gaining 20 to 100 pounds of body weight every single day. That's crazy. So if that's the case with these birds gaining all this weight, why aren't we seeing all these obese puffballs struggling to fly through the air or snapping off branches in trees? It's because of another one of their adaptations, shivering. At night, this is one of the ways they stay warm. For starters, they'll be deep inside the trees, shielded by all the branches, so that keeps them safe from the wind. And they sit there and they shiver. When you shiver, you're burning off the fat. That produces the heat. So essentially what's happening is these guys are losing all the weight that they've gained throughout the day. Talk about yo-yo dieting. Now, one of my favorite animals out here year-round, but especially for winter, is this critter right here. This is the Canada lynx. This is a great example of different winter adaptations because pretty much every feature on this critter makes him adapted for winter. But let's see if you guys can figure out which ones in particular. Is it maybe his camouflage? Or maybe his very long legs? Or maybe his big paws right here? Take our online poll now to see if you can figure out which of these is a really good winter adaptation. Our survey says almost 3/4 of you say all of the above. That is exactly right. Pretty much all the features that a lynx has help it survive during the winter. Its long legs are key, especially for in the deep winter. So when they are chasing down prey, if they happen to fall through the snow, chances are they're not going to get stuck with how long their legs are. It's actually interesting. The back legs of a lynx are actually longer than the front legs. Most of the time, they don't have to worry about crashing through the snow, though, because of their big, wide paws. These guys have built-in snowshoes. So these guys can fly right over the top of the snow with no problem. And the camouflage is another key factor. These guys do change a little bit throughout the season. In the summer, they're more of a dark brown color, so they blend in very well with the boreal forest floor. And then in the winter, they turn more gray to camouflage in with the snow. Now, speaking of camouflage, that brings up another really cool critter out here, the short-tailed weasel. We have a lot of weasels out here in the Whiteshell, and these guys definitely camouflage themselves, but they do it almost to the extreme in comparison to the lynx. True, they do change color because in the summer, they're kind of a dark brown, just like this. So similar to the lynx, they camouflage in very well with the boreal forest floor. But in winter, they change completely white, except for the little black tip on their tail there. Very good camouflage for running across the top of the snow. Not a whole lot of critters are going to see them. Other animals do this too, things like snowshoe hares and ptarmigans. They'll change color throughout the season to an extreme like this. But what's a little trickier is figuring out what makes them change color. And for our last poll, I'm going to ask you guys, what do you think makes the weasel change its color? Is it the change in the hours of the daylight? Is it the sudden sight of snow? Or is it the temperature? We'll see what you guys think. All right, see what our survey says. A lot of people think the temperature, over half of you. Some of you guys think it's the amount of snowfall, and 32% say the hours of daylight. For those of you that mentioned or selected the hours of daylight, you are correct. The temperature or the sight of snow actually has nothing to do with whether or not these guys are going to change color. It's not like they're just sitting out in the woods and all of a sudden they go, suddenly it's really cold. And they're white. It's actually the hours of the daylight. The way scientists figured this out was by observing them. And they found that the hours of the daylight were the key because year to year, that doesn't really change. It's around the same time of year every year that the days start to get shorter and the days start to get longer. What can change is when the first snowfall is and when all the snow is gone in the spring. They've seen in years where we've had a late start to winter, white weasels and white snowshoe hares running around on the brown ground. Same thing in the spring. When we have a late spring and there's still lots of snow around until sometimes the May long weekend, we see brown weasels and brown hares running around on the open snow. They stick out like a sore thumb. That's where they figured out it was the hours of daylight and not just the temperature or the sight of snow. Now, our last example is an animal that we don't typically associate with winter because we don't see it that much, or at all for that matter. And that is what donated this fur right here. This is the Canadian beaver, rather small one. And this adaptation, beavers are full of adaptations. Similar to a lynx, pretty much every feature on their body is some type of adaptation. But specifically for winter, we're going to look at the fur. So the beaver has essentially two layers of fur, a long, coarse outer layer, and then kind of a soft, short underlayer. That, combined with an oil that the beaver secretes and then grooms all over their body, keeps them waterproof. Because contrary to what a lot of people may think, beavers don't actually hibernate. They are less active in winter, but still active nonetheless. Really all they do is hold up in their lodge and occasionally have to go out underwater to grab some of their food caches that they've stored up over the summer. Anybody that's ever gone fishing around a beaver lodge knows that if you know what you're doing, that can be a good place to catch fish because of all the cover from the branches under there. However, if you're more of a novice like me, you know it's Snag City. Essentially what that is like I said, their food cache. And they have to have basically a built-in wetsuit so they can go underwater in the middle of February, which I don't advise anybody to do, grab their food cache and bring it back up into their lodge. All peoples throughout all time periods have always looked to nature to figure out some of the tricks of the trade in surviving. And like I said, this includes the indigenous peoples that inhabited the area long ago. We've looked at just a few examples today, but there's a whole lot more. There's some easy ways that we can really appreciate some of these adaptations moving forward. Number one, this is actually my favorite one, go for a snowshoe walk. Whether you're in the city or out in the country or near a provincial park, just going for a walk with snowshoes, you're really going to see how easy it is to walk either right across or go through the snow with them. And that is an adaptation directly picked up from nature. Another great way, if it's getting a little too cold out, which sporadically the last couple of days, I could see people not exactly wanting to go outside that much. Something you can do inside your house, observe wildlife. Set up some bird feeders in your yard or maybe in your backyard. If you have a big backyard, watch all the animals that go through. All through time, observing animals is how we've picked up these adaptations. So who knows, maybe by watching some of these animals, you'll pick up a new adaptation for yourself to survive this winter. I want to thank you all very much for listening to me and joining us for this webinar this morning. And now if there's any questions, I can do my best to answer those.
So if you have any questions, please type them in the chat or in the Q&A window. We'll take a couple minutes to answer any. So a question from Chris, who asked, does Manitoba Parks have any trails specifically groomed or recommended for snowshoeing?
So in the Whiteshell specifically, there are a couple of trails that once we get enough snow, we do maintain and groom for winter walking or snowshoeing. Pine Point is a very common one on Highway 307. It's a 2.5 kilometer straight shot that is specifically maintained for snowshoeing. It's a 2.5 kilometer walk to get you to the rapids and 2.5 kilometers to get you back. And by the way, the rapids is what we see behind me right here. And I was up there a few days ago. It does look like this. It is very cool. The other loop that's there as well, that's about 2.7 kilometers, we don't maintain it or groom it, but it gets so much use that you can snowshoe or walk on it very easily throughout the winter. There's a few other trails in the Whiteshell, Loop B at the Jessica Lake Trails, which is again on 307. So those are some of my favorite ones that I go to that are specifically groomed for snowshoeing or winter walking.
Yeah, I just shared a web link in the chat to our winter trail information on the website. So
perfect.
There's a question here from Emily who asks, what do rabbits do in the winter? Do they hibernate?
So rabbits, similar to our short-tailed weasel, this guy that I showed earlier, they stay active all winter long and they change color just like the weasel. So in the summer, they're pretty much the same. They don't quite have the white belly, but their entire body is kind of a dark brown like this. And then when the winter comes, they turn completely white, same as the weasel. So not just predators have that camouflage trait, prey animals have it as well. Also, is kind of why it's hard to see them sometimes too.
Emily also asks, what do the animals eat in the winter?
In short, whatever they can find. So things like lynx and short-tailed weasels, they will go after snowshoe hare or really any other fur-bearing animal they can get a hold of. And for other animals like the beaver, we talked about, they store up food caches of wood, so branches that are under the water there. And the first animal I showed you, the gray jay, they will eat seeds out of bird feeders or seeds that they find, and any type of insects or insect larvae, depending on the time of year within the trees.
Our next question comes from Candace, who asked, what do birds eat during the winter?
So similar to what I just said at the end, the birds that we have sticking around, which are pretty much just perching birds, they'll eat seeds that they find either at feeders or out in the trees. And sometimes a lot of them, like black-capped chickadees, they're very common to store food in lots of different areas. I actually read a research article one time that said black-capped chickadees can remember up to, I think it was 30 different locations that they've stored and hidden food in the last little while. And again, if there's insects or larvae within the trees, that's what they'll go for.
The next question here is, how do turtles adapt to winter?
They sleep. Turtles are one of the animals that hibernate, and turtles actually have a special term. A hibernating turtle is brumating. That's the term for turtles when they hibernate. So what they do is they go down to either the bottom of a river or the bottom of a pond, and they dig down into the mud, and they sit there all winter. They don't eat, they don't drink, they hibernate. And then once it gets warm enough, they come back out and resume their life.
Audrey asks, why are we not supposed to feed the deer?
We are not supposed to feed the deer or any form of wildlife, with the exception of perching birds in winter. I'll explain that in a second. But for things like deer or foxes, we don't want to feed those animals because we can habituate them. Now, habituating is a fancy term for what happens when an animal forgets how to get food on its own in the wild. So if we feed the deer or the fox all year long, let's say we're a cottager and we come out and do that in the summer, well, they may have a food source in the summer, but then when everybody leaves in the winter, they've forgotten how to get food on their own because they rely on people and they won't survive through. Another thing, especially with deer, is deer may look all fine and cute in the summer, but when they go into their rut in the fall, you do not exactly want to be around a male deer. They can act aggressively. So if they're not used to being around people and they're scared of us, that's good because we do not want that to happen. I was also going to say with the birds, because I've explained that before, and then people will ask, why is it okay to feed the birds then? There was a study done in Wisconsin in 1986 where they had two groups of black-capped chickadees. And one group had both groups had all the access to all their natural food. But one group also had access to a fully stocked bird feeder. So the group that had the access to the bird feeder obviously came to the bird feeder and ate. And then for the second phase of that study, they took away that bird feeder. Now the assumption was, since they're used to getting fed by the bird feeder, they would all start dying off because they wouldn't know how to eat on their own. Not so. The mortality rate, so the rate of how many of them perished in both groups, was exactly the same. The fact that one group had a bird feeder had nothing to do with their survival rate. When the bird feeder was taken away, they just went back to their natural food source. So we definitely don't want you feeding foxes or deer, but it is okay in the winter months to feed the birds.
Question here from Jessica, who asks, are there any changes to wolves during the winter?
There's a few changes. Some of them can change color a little bit, not as much as the lynx and definitely not as much as the weasel. They may change a little bit in terms of how active they are. All animals in general in winter are a little less active. Combination of it's a little colder, plus in general, animals don't know when their next meal is going to be. They're kind of like the opposite of us. We're working out and trying to go crazy to lose weight. Animals, especially in the winter that are active, want to do the exact opposite. They want to put on as many calories as they can because they don't know when their next meal is going to be. I know when mine is. It's when I turn the computer off. Animals don't. So they want to conserve all their energy. So in winter, they might be a little less active, but that's going to be about it. Actually, one other change, sorry, it just popped into my head. We'll talk a little more about this at a webinar we're doing in January. In January, the wolves actually start howling quite a bit more. And just briefly, January is wolf mating season. So that's what they're doing in January. So that's one key thing they do change in the winter is they start mating to have their pups.
Okay, a question here from Candace who asks, thank you, and do squirrels ever go out of their home during the winter?
They absolutely do. You can just ask my dogs that are probably barking at them out the window right now. Squirrels, again, they try to be maybe a little less active to conserve energy, but they've also stored up a lot of food caches and they will come out of their holes either to go to one of their cache or to find some other source of food, especially if you have bird feeders in your yard.
Okay, and we got time for one more question here, which is, how can animals survive if they are trapped on a piece of ice that's floating on a lake, pond, or an ocean?
Depends what kind of animal it is. If it's something like a wolf or a lynx, they can actually swim. Wolves, for those of us that have pet dogs, a lot of us know that they can swim. Wolves can too, but so can lynx. They've actually found a number of places, instances where lynx have swam, I'm not sure exactly how long, but it's longer than you would think a lynx would swim. So I guess the old adage of all cats hate water is not quite true when you get out to the wild.
Okay.
Well, if that's all our questions, then again, I want to thank you all very much for joining me this morning for this webinar. And with the holiday season coming up, we obviously want everybody to have a safe and happy holiday season at home. If anybody is going to be venturing out into the parks, either to explore or go on a trail, we want to make sure everybody is following COVID-19 public health orders. So ideally, we want people to stay in their own household group, or if you are going to be meeting up with friends, practice all the fundamental principles of social distancing, staying 6 feet apart, wearing masks, and using hand sanitizer as much as possible, especially after you touch anything, whether it be in an outhouse or a pit privy. And I will point out that actually all the shelters, if you're going along a trail in the park that does have a shelter, whether it's a snowmobile shelter or a ski shelter, all of those are currently closed. We want to wish everybody a nice, safe, and happy winter. And I want to make sure everybody knows about the next webinar coming up, which is December 23rd at 6:30 p.m. That's this coming Wednesday. If you're interested in trails, then that webinar is all about winter trails and experiences. To register for that, you can go to manitobaparks.com or visit our Manitoba Parks Facebook page. One last time, I want to thank you all very much for inviting me into your home this morning, and have a safe and happy holiday season.